Super Leaders and Super Seders with our guests, Rabba Yaffa Epstein, Esther Kustanowitz, and David A.M. Wolinski. Haggadah.com is a space where people of Jews of all backgrounds are welcome to find a place for themselves in the Passover story so that they can create more meaningful, personal, and connective seders. When you come to our site, you can mix and match different pieces of content to create your own Haggadah, and we will be sharing a very special Haggadah during this at the end of this call, and as part of the recording, we will share a link to that Haggadah as well. And we are a project of Custom and Craft Jewish Rituals, which is a nonprofit design lab for the Jewish community, experimenting with technology, media, and video to imagine new formats for engaging with ancient rituals and traditions. And we are so excited to have you all here today. I am going to welcome our moderator for the afternoon, Esther Kustanowitz. Excuse me. Esther Kustanowitz is an award-winning writer and podcaster and TV columnist at The J, which is the Jewish news of Northern California. She hosts the Bagel Report podcast, which is, I believe, an award-winning podcast at this point, and presents regularly on the increase of Jewish content on television through her hashtag TV Gone Jewy project. Esther is also the incredible creator of last year's Schitt's Creek Haggadah and this year's Heroes Haggadah, which is connected to our topic this afternoon. And we are delighted to have her here. And I'm going to throw it over to Esther. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I keep getting notifications that you've muted me, but I'm assuming if people can't hear me, they will certainly let me know 100% of the time.
You are all good now.
Okay. All right. So welcome. We're so excited to tackle this topic here today. And I want to start out just as we do this time of year with 4 questions. And this is not the last questions, because obviously we all have questions all the time. But since in tribute to the Haggadah, I want to ask you to consider these questions as we move forward as kind of intentions, okay? So the first question is, why do we love superheroes? Then question 2, why might we embrace rituals that make room for battle and connections to the infinite? What are our responsibilities to worlds outside our own, and how does today's stories intersect with our classic texts and shared history? So those are 4 questions that I'm kind of using as we go into our conversation today. And I also want to start with one little piece of text. I'm not the text person on this call. I bow in deference to the Rabba Yaffa. But I want to just share this one little snippet, which is from the Ethics of the Fathers, and it's Mishahu Gibor Hakovesh et Yitzro, who is mighty, who is a hero, the person who conquers their inclination. And so that's something to think about in terms of what one of the classical visions of a hero is somebody who manages to conquer or suppress their own inclinations towards, self-elevation or self-interest, and perhaps makes a different choice. So we're going to talk about heroes in a general sense, in a metaphorical sense, in a specific sense. We're here to share what we find heroic, both in our sacred texts of Judaism and our sacred texts of popular culture. And we'll talk about things like sin and redemption, violence, injustice, pragmatism, and heart. We're going to just cover it all in an hour. It's going to be great. And depending on who your favorite heroes are, they may have less or more of these qualities, fewer or more of these qualities. So I just want to say also before we get started that this isn't just about my brilliant friends who are brilliant, and I'm so excited to talk to them about this, but it's also about you. So the chat section is open as always in the Zoom space, and I will be popping in there to check occasionally while we're conversing, and Rebecca is going to be in there, and Rin, who's also part of the Haggadah team, is going to be in there. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to add them in the chat. But I want to start by asking you to first tell me where you're from, So type into the chat where you're from and then hit enter. And then I'm going to ask you another question and ask you to hold your responses so that we can all speak in one voice. Okay, so we've got people from all over the place: Toronto, Chicago, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Delray Beach, San Francisco. We haven't repeated a single town yet. What do you get? One representative from every place? Okay, a couple of San Francisco. Okay, that's great.
I'll put those questions back into the chat. I think somebody had asked for that, so I'll go ahead and put those back in there. So.
Okay. All right. Those are just kind of guiding things to think about today. But the question I really want to ask, thank you so much for sharing where you're from. It's really marvelous to see people from all over the place, from the UK, from Israel. I'm going to be visiting both of you very soon. And it's just really tremendous to have all of these different kinds of voices here with us. And we're looking forward to hearing from you. So the one thing I want to start by saying is, I want to start with a question, and I want to ask you to write your answers, but don't hit return until I say go, okay? We're all clear on that. So the first question is, what qualities make a hero? What qualities make a hero? Write it in the chat. Don't hit return yet. I see you want to, but don't. Okay, we're going to give you 3 more seconds, and then we're going to hit return, okay? 3, 2, 1. Boom. It's so nice when that happens. Look at when it works out. You all managed to wait. That's awesome. I have a friend who calls this a chat scade. I have also heard it referred to as a chat burst or a chatterfall. Sometimes I like to think of it as a collective chat sigh, kind of like we're all in the room together and breathing in and breathing out, and this is what we've breathed out. Okay, great. So we've got generosity, social justice, selflessness, honesty, integrity, strong for others. We've got courage, empathy, using strength for others, self-awareness. Don't go chasing chatterfalls. Thanks, Julie. And laser vision is also really helpful, David. So you're right about that. Okay. Who is your, this is the next, these are 2 more questions. The next question is, who is your hero, fictional or real? And there's no judgments. Go wild, give us your dark horse candidate and make, as long as you can justify it. There are definitely kids running around idolizing Darth Vader and Kylo Ren. So really, whoever you think is the hero, you're right, because I know that you can justify it. Okay, and 1, 2, 3, go. Ooh. Zelensky and Thor. Boy, what a duo that would make. Thanks, Tom.
2 votes for Captain Picard.
Yes. We've also got Rabbi Akiva. We'll hear more about that from Yaffa in a bit, I'm assuming. Wonder Woman, who possibly is Sue Fishkoff, by the way. And Ram Dass, Judge Jackson, Golda Meir. Okay, great. And the last question is, what is the most important quality for a leader to have? This is kind of like a rehash of that first question about what qualities make a hero. What's the number 1 quality that a leader must have? Okay, we're gonna type it in, and I'm gonna give you a 5-second countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Going with empathy again, integrity, vision, strong tendency toward avodah to others, to listen to those who disagree with them. Remember that they're there to serve others, not their own agenda, and sublimate your own ego. Right, compassion. This is all great. Okay, it sounds like you guys already know what heroes are. So while we're in this space, I want to start with our panelists. We'd like to start in chronological fandom order. So that means the first up is Jewish sources, because they predate everything. So we're going to have Rabba Yaffa at the helm, and then we'll go on to David, and we'll go places where no one has gone before. That might be a teaser. And then I'll share some thoughts, and then we'll have time for questions, and we'll talk a little bit about the Heroes Haggadah as well. Okay? So nice to see you both in the featured mode on the screen. Yaffa, could you start by telling us a little bit about how you interpreted this this idea of heroism, but in the biblical context.
Sure. Thank you so much, Esther. Great to be with you. And David, what an honor to be with you on this panel. Nice background. Wow, that is impressive. I'm really excited to be here. There's a lot of friends in the audience, and for those who I don't know yet, nice to meet you. When Esther and I were talking about this panel, of course, when you're thinking about Passover and heroes, like Moses is obviously, sort of number one. Although let's not forget Miriam, because she was really important in this story, and we have to come back to her too. But I sort of, I don't know, some of you know this about me, I've sort of struggled with Moshe for a really long time. He's actually, I feel like, a very misunderstood character in the Bible and often championed as this amazing leader, but I think he really had a real struggle. So when we meet Moshe for the first time, well, we meet him as a baby, but we're gonna, if it's okay, Esther, can I share my screen for a sec?
I think you can. Rebecca's, she says yes. You're the co-host now.
Awesome. I love it.
Try not to let the power go to your head.
I love it. I'm such a superpower hero. So here we are. This is when we meet Moshe for the first time. And well, as a person, we met him as a baby earlier, and there's a lot to say about what these verses, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. These verses between chapter 2, verse 1 through 10, because there we have a lot of superheroes there about Moshe's mothers, and I say that on purpose because he has multiple mothers, and there's lots to talk about there, which we can delve into. But when we meet Moshe, the teenager, I like to say, what happens is, right, these are very famous verses, so apologies if you've seen them many times, but I just want to look at them in the context of what we're talking about here, which is this superhero panel. We meet Moshe as a hero, right, as a superhero, in that we're in verse here 11, Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors, he, right, saw the pain, and people talked about vision, people talked about empathy. Moshe here is clearly, right, seeing the pain of his brothers. Huge question, I would say, whether Moshe knows at this point that he is Jewish and they are his brothers, but in any event, he sees the pain of the Jewish people. And his response, and Esther, we might get here, but in defense of, right, his people or any people who are suffering. And we see him strike the Egyptian. And then this is, I think, the best part of the story that gets maybe more overlooked, which is he goes out the next day, right, and he finds 2 Jews fighting with each other, right? And then suddenly his critique, why do you strike your fellow, right, is sort of an interesting thing, because just yesterday he had also struck someone and killed them, right? And to see this sort of immediate, wait, why are you doing that, right? And the response of, who do you think you are, from the Jews, which, by the way, I just love. It's always my favorite line. It's the most Jewish line possible, right? Oh, really? Now you remember that you're Jewish? Now you're suddenly part of our community? Now you care about us, right? Sort of this feeling of where you been all this time? And who made you chief and ruler over us? Even though, of course, Moshe is effectively chief and ruler over them if he's a prince from Pharaoh's, right, palace. So that all of these fascinating moments and this accusation, do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Moshe was frightened and thought, the thing is known. And right, lo and behold, Paro learns about it. He wants to kill Moshe. Moshe flees, and he goes down, right, till he arrives in the land of Midian. So Moshe runs away. So you could say, is this a superhero moment? When we talk about sort of origin stories of superheroes, it's a really, I think, a fascinating conversation about Moshe's origin story being one of empathy, misplaced power, and the fear that results of that from that misplaced power, I think. And later, when he's called on by God to, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, to take up the mantle of leadership, Moshe's response is, are you crazy? Right? My one attempt to be a superhero, I stepped into power, I stepped into responsibility, I failed, I was unable to bring the people to be with me, and I was unable to sort of step into that power. I basically failed when I tried to. And God's response being, I don't really care, you have to do it anyway. And then, as every great superhero gets, he got a trusty sidekick named Aaron. right? So that's a really important moment as well, that like God says, okay, you're a flawed hero. Therefore, we're going to give you this superhero named Aaron. That's your Aaron. So I guess, Esther, the question I want to ask is, and I'm sort of interested about in terms of superheroes, is what does it mean when our heroes step into power and fail? And what does it mean that Moshe, like, where was Moshe more authentically a hero? When he tried to step in using physical violence on the Egyptian, or when he says to God, I can't do this, don't give me this role? Was that a heroic moment? Or when he finally acquiesces because he has his brother Aaron who's going to support him? At what moment of those three sort of moments was Moses a hero, right? Stepping into responsibility, but failing, trying to back away from responsibility, and then eventually taking up the mantle of responsibility with the right tools? Those are my questions.
Those are great questions. And while we're pondering those questions, and I will get back to them, I realized that I don't think I introduced either one of you in any significant way. And so I want to just rectify that very briefly. But David's just chilling on the deck of the Enterprise, so he's cool where he is. But Rabba Yaffa Epstein was the director of the Wexner Heritage Program, was formerly director of education for North America at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, received rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Maharat, and holds a law degree from Bar Ilan University. She loves Talmud, but she also loves popular culture, so we obviously became fast friends. And although we haven't gotten to David Wilensky yet, and we will let him speak, I promise, David is the digital editor of J, the Jewish News of Northern California, and co-founder of the Star Trek Jew Posting Facebook group. He lives in San Francisco, and I know that he is also involved in a number of other fandoms as well, so that may come out during our conversations, although we may stick to the Enterprise because he seems pretty geographically rooted there right now. So yeah, going back to Yaffa and what you were just talking about, and I think that there's a lot of really interesting questions here. And when you were talking about the idea of, I took notes on it too, about like the idea of like, who do you think you are, even though he is a prince? And I was just thinking about, is he a fresh prince, perhaps? Is he a fresh prince of Bel-Air? And as some of you, David's groaning. I can, it's muted, but I can hear you groaning. It's fine. This is me. You guys know this is what you get with me. So I've been thinking about this moment from the Oscars all week, as a lot of other people have, and there are many people who have issued commentaries far more brilliant than what I'm about to share. But one of the things that has struck me is in preparing for this idea of like, what does it mean to be a hero? And the hero often has a moment where they shrug off the mantle because it's just too much. It's in conflict with something that they're feeling and they need to do in that moment. And the question of whether they can ever regain that status of hero, the fallen hero who rises again, in some ways is even more powerful than you could possibly imagine sometimes. But I think that this is all really interesting, to think about what do we expect from our heroes, who are, after all, people, right? And Moses, in particular, being known as somebody who is modest, right? That he was modest, and that there was almost nobody like him, and the idea of like saying, I don't have the speech, I can't be a hero because I don't know how to talk in front of power. I don't know how to speak to power. And then pairing him with somebody who could. And in some ways, I'm also thinking about the Oscars in terms of like being a leader, even though, there were many people in that audience who, when Coda won for best film, they did the they did the applause, but in ASL. So like in American Sign Language. So like the idea of making sure that people can understand you is an important part of the leadership. So I think, and I think that, you know, the idea of like trying to make sure everybody understands you, it's a burden. It can be a burden, but it also enables people to access wisdom, freedom, justice, liberation, all of those things that we talk about when we're talking about the seder. So I would love to hear if you have any feedback on that, Yaffa, on the idea of how a hero might restore a heroic status after a fall.
So that is, I think, a very interesting question. Like, does Moshe manage to come back to heroic status? I think, is that what you're asking, Esther? Like, or do we have other examples where someone falls? I mean, Aaron is an amazing example of that, if you will, right? Because he's the one who sort of says to the people, Moshe's gone. The people are like, where's our leader, right? And Aaron, I would say, and this is a huge debate, right, among the commentaries, whether Aaron, at the moment when he says, okay, bring me your jewelry, I'll make this golden calf, whether that's a failure or not. But let's go with the idea that he failed in that moment, right? There seems to be the capacity, he's so beloved by the people still, even after that failure. So I wonder if it's about, like, if you have built the requisite trust with your community and then you fail, right? Is it possible that after you do the necessary work, whatever we deem that to be, you can be redeemed in a way? And do you become even stronger? I don't know if you saw this. I wasn't planning to say this until you asked this question, Esther, but a couple of weeks ago, there was a piece in the New York Times called, I don't remember the title exactly, but it was about apologizing. Did anyone see this? It's an amazing piece all about like how politicians apologize and they're forgiven, and how like today, like apologies are just like 1 in a million now, and all these, like, and now like you have to apologize all the time. There's just like this demand to be apologizing all the time. And once upon a time, when you like stood up there and did a press conference, like those mea culpas like really worked. And now when it's like 2 sentences on Twitter, they're just not trusted in the same way. And we don't actually allow people to use the apology in the way we once did. So I think it's an interesting question about like, what level of repentance do you need to do in order to get back to, and I don't know, like for me, this is why I like Yom Kippur is so fascinating. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say about Yom Kippur and heroism. We didn't really talk about that, but I think it's an interesting thing, particularly, I mean, if you think about Moses breaking the tablets, right, that his redemption, or the redemption of the people, I should say, really comes, the second tablets are given on Yom Kippur, right? And the sort of this or culminate in Yom Kippur, and sort of this fascinating, important message that you could have experienced God, engaged in the worst possible thing, which is worshiping idols, and specifically the idol of, of like an Egyptian god, or you left and you worship an Egyptian god like immediately after you received the Torah, right? And that just a few months later, built into our calendar is the capacity to receive forgiveness. I think there's a message there of like the highs you can get to, the lows you can get to, and then the capacity for redemption just a few months later, like built into the calendar is that capacity for redemption. What do you think about that, Esther? David?
Well, I think that we expect a lot from our heroes, and we're also incredibly human, as are they. Most people aren't experiencing God the way Moses or the Jewish people coming out of Egypt did. So we don't necessarily have that like baseline layer even for belief or knowledge of something beyond ourselves, or whatever the prevailing metaphor is. But I think that we all have our own barometer for how we look at forgiveness, how we look at something that is unforgivable. We have things we can't get past and things we ignore. And I think it's really different for everybody always. I would love to talk about this, and I think maybe we should do like a part 2 webinar in terms of Yom Kippur, because I think that there's more there for this. We could have like a year of heroes where we just talk about every holiday through the lens of heroes. But I want to move on to David, because something Yaffa said to me, and the idea of Moses and Aaron as like a team up, like kind of like a Batman and Robin, you know, kind of like complimenting one another, not like, oh, Batman, you look great today, but the other kind of compliment, where you talk about like you fill in what the other person lacks. And I thought, and David, you may want to, like, you know, shoot me with set your phaser to stun or whatever when I say this, but I feel like the Kirk-Spock dynamic is a little bit like that, because Kirk is like, and at least this is from my perspective as an outsider, just from the popular culture, that Kirk is very like hot-headed and reactive, whereas Spock is very logical and you know, kind of just looks at things without any emotion at all. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that in terms of heroism. Do you have a sense as to whether do you view either one of them as more heroic, or are they this kind of a team like Moses and Aaron, like Batman and Robin?
Great question. I didn't bring a source sheet with me to share, but I did bring a GIF of my personal fictional hero, which we don't actually have to keep looking at. I wanted to also share my screen for a moment. So I think actually what Star Trek fans will talk a lot about, but gets lost, I think, in the more general pop culture space where people talk a lot about Kirk and Spock, is that there's a trio. There's Kirk, there's Spock, and there's Dr. McCoy. So Kirk is gung-ho, he's a man of action. Spock is one little spirit on his shoulder, telling him to hold back and be more analytical and not act so rashly. And Dr. McCoy is sitting on his other shoulder, sort of irate and impatient, but always from a place of an interest in compassion and justice. So then on, you know, and then on the other side, Spock is saying, well, yes, that would be the just thing to do, but there are these other factors we have to consider. We shouldn't act rashly, whatever. And what makes Kirk a great leader is that he has both of those guys there bringing these seemingly contradictory impulses, and that keeps Kirk even keeled, with an eye on sort of the you know, McCoy's clear-eyed sense of morality and Spock's clear-eyed sense of logic and patience. And I think, and that theme gets expanded on a lot in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and that's why Picard is my, you know, in the great like Star Trek war over like who's the better captain. One of the reasons I like Picard and think about Picard a lot when I'm in a leadership position is he's a guy who's got the best and the brightest around him, lots of perspectives. And when there's a crisis, he turns to them and he asks for options, suggestions. What are the things that we could do here? And so he's like the most heroic like manager in pop culture, right? His thing is like he's got a team of people he trusts and he wants to get their input before he acts. And I think that's actually an interesting counterpoint to Moses, who, right, at some point has to be told like, man, you need, I see Rebecca in the chat, big ENTJ energy from Picard. I actually think he's an INTJ, but that's another webinar. But Moses has to be told at a certain point by one of his trusted advisors that like, man, you need to delegate more. You need more people under you, right? And ends up establishing that, this whole system of judges and what have you. But I think that is something that Moses lacks as a hero is, he's got a few close confidants, but he's not like pulling on the full expertise of the community. And, they're like, he's got all these tribes and he's got the priests and all this, like there are a lot of sources of leaders in his world, and he doesn't pull on them for help very much. And I think, just to stay on the Moses thing for a second, I think the interesting tension about like this whole conversation that we're having and this whole idea of a hero's Haggadah is that if you think about the story of the Exodus, it's easy to go, okay, Moses is like the protect story of the Haggadah. Moses is famously absent. It's a story that actually doesn't want you to think so much about this obvious human hero. It wants you to be focused on the sort of communal liberation that is brought about primarily by God. And I think then, just to take it a little further, I think there's a general, I think in some corner, in some Judaisms, let me say, there is a general discomfort with the strong hero. Right, there are any number of sort of super heroic characters in the Bible. You look at Samson, right? But Samson, like he has a superpower and it comes from his hair, right? Like that's like a weird, golden age superhero setup. But we don't tend to talk or think a lot about Samson, right? Who is the prototypical strong man. We look at someone like Moses, who, aside from his characterization in the Bible itself, the way that he's treated in Midrash and in the Talmud as Moshe Rabbeinu, the teacher. That sort of knowledge-based, considerate heroism is the kind of thing that I think when we talk about heroes in Judaism, that's the kind of hero we would tend to look to. And times when Jews have looked to strong men as leaders, I don't want to get into too much politics, but that doesn't always work out so great. And
Right.
and that is a route through which you can lose your moral and ethical moorings.
Right. And I will say also that Yaffa, I'm sorry, I don't know if this was a pause where I could interrupt, but Yaffa and I did a session for Limud in New York several years ago, before we knew about a thing called a pandemic, where we talked about this concept of Jews in power, right? So, and how it's reflected through popular culture. And while this is a little bit of a little deviation from the actual heroes conversation, it is about heroism and like the question of what do we as Jews, as if there is a a unilateral decision about what Jews are or what we believe, which we all know is not true. But the idea that Jews as a whole may be very uncomfortable with these kinds of the Samson model of power, right? It's very visible, it's very visceral, it's physical, and we are more likely to say, oh, we can lead by inspiring, or like, and all those things can both be true. But, when Yaffa and I talked about it, we talked about Inglorious Bastards, for instance. Are those people who, start killing Nazis and, are they heroes? Is the Mossad going undercover and infiltrating and eliminating, like, is that heroic? And why we're so uncomfortable maybe with those kinds of heroes is something we could explore again in depth, everywhere, always. But I think, and especially there is another series coming out about a group of Holocaust survivors who go and kill Nazis. I forgot what it's called. Maybe somebody wants to say it in the chat, but there is something else coming out. soon about that. So we'll probably be having that conversation again. And part of it is also generational. So very famously, there was a scene in the movie Knocked Up, where there was all of a sudden a conversation in a bar with a bunch of Jewish guys talking about how inspiring they found the movie Munich, because it was about Jews kicking ass, and they hadn't seen that before. So I think it's just interesting to keep this in mind as we move toward as we move through the rest of this webinar, and we'll get, of course, to questions as well. But I think that there's something in there that we always have to kind of come to terms with, almost rather than celebrate, about heroism, is that heroism sometimes comes with visibility and power and violence. Yaffa, do you have anything to say about that? Or David,
I really wanted to lift up David's point about God being the hero of the Haggadah. I think that's a brilliant insight. I really love that. And in fact, we sing me and not a malach, not an angel, me and not someone else, not my shaliach, it was me. I was a superhero of the Passover story. I love that. But I guess I would ask, is that more proof that we're uncomfortable with physical power? And the only one who should be using physical power is God, right? God can do this, but not Moshe.
Yeah, which
sorry.
I don't love theologically or politically, frankly, because Mashiach isn't coming because of our passivity, right? Any liberation struggle requires the heroism of the oppressed. In the real world, in the contemporary world. So I have some discomfort with the idea that if you put your trust in God alone and don't take any action yourself, that in my experience doesn't get you very far. But the Haggadah is an idealized version of the story. And there's that discomfort with the potential of building sort of a cult around Moses, which we have successfully sidestepped. But, they talk about the reason why we don't know where Moses is buried, and it's so no one can turn it into a reverential site. And of course, you can look at Uman, or or the Rebbe's grave in New York, right? And those are places that have become, I think, inappropriately sites of veneration. So there's a real resistance to lifting people up, because once you get to the level of a superhero, I think as overall despicable as Zack Snyder's DC superhero movies have been, they are exploring the idea of superheroes as essentially unrelatable godlike figures. And we don't want that, right? As Anita is pointing out in the chat right now, it's idol worshiping. Sue is noting that Mizrahi Jews also venerate graves of hero rabbis. Yes, right. And I think that that's pretty dicey
well, I think there's also
for monotheists.
There can also be a difference between honoring, celebrating, venerating, idolizing, right? So to visit the grave of somebody who has passed, who was inspiring to you regularly, is not necessarily idol worship. Maybe consulting that headstone and waiting for a leaf to fall on your head. I don't know. I just made that up. That's not a thing that people do. But my point is that, like, you know, we're all drawing our lines in a different place as well in terms of what is considered acceptable, mishubach, or praiseworthy, or what is, you know, crazy and, like, just, you know, not in the spirit of Judaism, you know. And I think that everybody draws that line in a different place. And David, I know that you've been, you know, in your journalistic life, you've been to visit a lot of synagogues and spiritual communities. So you know that also, that in every community, probably they'll have a different gloss on this whole idea of what a hero is and who they look up to and who should lead the Jews and who should lead their micro community and all of that. So I think that that's all worth keeping in mind. Now I want to move kind of into some of the talk about.
Can I just respond to a comment in the? Can I just respond to a comment in the chat from Tina? Yeah. Visiting the Lincoln Memorial in DC is inspiring, she says. Yes, and like architecturally, it is meant to look like a Greco-Roman temple. So
right.
It is. So, it's a, you know, these are religious sites.
Right, and I think that there's a lot about a site that, you know, the geographical location or the architectural construction of something might give you an idea of religion. Even a movie theater, right, or a stage theater, right? You feel like you're looking up, there it is. Oh, it's so great, you know, whatever the story is, you can look to it. And especially because, you know, when you're talking, I live in Hollywood, Hollywood adjacent, so I have to mention the industry once every webinar. But you know, the idea of like of Hollywood just kind of like elevating people on a screen that makes them giant. And you know, one of the things that the Israelites said when they sent spies into the land of Israel, they're like, the people are giants there. It's like, it's so unbelievable. Like everything is giant. This is a very large scale, and it was very intimidating. And I think that in terms of leadership, we often view our leaders, even if they are not as big as giants, that they are intimidating, and we wouldn't know what to say to them. We would be like the Moses without an Aaron at our side, and we would, you know, stumble in our speech and not be worthy of talking to them. But I think that the reality is that, you know, leadership can come from anywhere. There are lots of different models of leadership, from the physical to the spiritual to the logical to the, you know, to the action-oriented heroism is also important, even if it's not something that everybody's, you know, comfortable with. So I think that I want to open it up formally to questions, even though we've been getting some great questions and comments as we've been going. So I think that there's a lot. I mean, Sue Fishcock, you know I love you, and you have been popping in the comment section, which I appreciate, talking about how you don't take your unmarried daughters to the Lincoln Memorial to pray for a husband, although maybe somebody on this call will do that now. You know, to pray for justice, maybe, and then also if Abe has it in his purview, a husband or a wife or whatever the story is. So I think that there's definitely like a lot more to talk about. But I want to ask anybody in the audience, what, in terms of how do you view heroism, and how do you relate it to the themes of the Haggadah? What will you be bringing to your seder table this year in terms of this conversation about heroes? And while you think about that and maybe answer some questions in the side comments in the chat box, I also want to introduce formally the Haggadot Heroes Haggadah, which is available on the haggadot.com website. It's on the main page. It's basically a collection of gifts and then associated, thank you, Yaffa, for the heart. Thank you, Rebecca, for the link. Boy, it's a real team effort here today. See, I think leadership is team effort. And like, I feel like there's little moments of heroism happening all the time. And so I think that's awesome. And there are definitely enough heroes who come from modest backgrounds who, you know, some of whom may be force sensitive, but some of whom may not be force sensitive and just may have leadership kind of placed in front of them and they choose it, kind of like Moses did in a midrash. But so as Rebecca said, the Haggadah will be shared with everybody who registered as well.
And I'll put a link in the chat for the other upcoming webinars, just if folks want to register. So we'll send that too.
Great. Awesome. And I just want to get that in there. We're not ending early probably, but you know, I see people are just like, how do we get it? How do we get it? Which is awesome. And I think that that's, and it's right there. And so thank you, Rebecca, for making that easy for everyone. And so in looking at the, I found a lot of the gifts and then kind of sometimes retrofitted them to the things that I was looking for. And so some of them may seem a little random, but I think in a good way. I was very happy to be able to take the lens of the seder order and the different components that go into the seder and apply them to this general lens of like, what do we think a hero is? And to look at some of the things like what if, AKA Dayenu, which is basically, if you don't know what it is, since I haven't talked about the MCU yet, the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the TV shows that are on Disney Plus now, there's a show called What If that's an animated show that reimagines the heroes of Marvel playing different roles than they originally played. So instead of Captain America, who is in love with Peggy Carter and always doomed to be away from her, Peggy Carter becomes Captain Carter. She takes the superhero serum and becomes the supercharged heroine hero. So I think that the idea of like trying to imagine, I've always said what if is midrash. You can listen to my podcast and I say that like when What If was running weekly episodes, every week I was like, what if is midrash? What if is midrash? But it's also, you know, it also enables me to look at Dayenu, which has been, you know, one of those earworm songs that just, you know, I mean, just even think about like the physicality of having to articulate those musical sounds. Die, Dayenu, die, right? So it's just like die, it means enough, and it also means to die. And so like, you know, the question of like, how do you take something that you've heard many, many times before and look at it through a different lens? And that is really the challenge of what if. So I think that the idea of trying to say, you know, what if we got out of Egypt but didn't, you know, wander the desert? And what if we wandered the desert but didn't have any place to go? Or what if we, you know, what if we were at Mount Sinai but didn't get the Torah? Or what if we, all of these things like give you the opportunity to say, well, that would have been terrible. But it also may have taken us in a different direction that we would be recounting now. So it's really interesting to note these divergent points in the timeline. Where there could have been, to borrow from Loki, there could have been like a time variant and a split. So I think that popular culture always can be used as a lens on Jewish culture and vice versa. That is really kind of what drives me in my life and in my work. It's what drove the Schitt's Creek Haggadah last year, and that, you know, there was just a lot of things in the Schitt's Creek universe that we could play with in terms of creating ideas, creating new glosses on the ideas of the Haggadah. So I urge you to check it out, and also Haggadot.com in general. Even if you're not into heroes, which is, if you are not into heroes, why are you on this webinar? But you're welcome. There's a lot of other kinds of lenses that you can put onto the Haggadah stuff, on the Haggadah text. Everything from sobriety to LGBTQ to social justice to racism and rape culture and all of these other things that you might not necessarily think could be a lens, but they can be. And the fact that we do this ritual every year enables us to revisit this space and say, who are we this year? And how do we view these same things that we've always viewed? And how do we look at them and try to read them a little bit differently? So we we've got a few minutes left, and before I want to throw it back to Yaffa and to David for any kind of closing thoughts or comments, either on anything that we've said here or things that you just thought of and you just want to share with us. And then I'll throw it back to Rebecca, and she'll give us a little bit of an outro, and then we'll go about the rest of our days. And thank you all for being here. And you can put more questions in the chat now if you'd like as well. Why don't we start with you, David, since we started with Yaffa? So.
Well, first of all, Esther, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. It's been great fun. And Yaffa, it's such an honor to be sharing a Zoom screen with you. I'm very attracted to this what if is midrash idea. I talk a lot about fanfic as midrash, and not just fanfic, but just like the little fixes you have in your head, you know, for like why this one thing in that episode is inconsistent with this other thing in that other episode. Like that's the midrashic impulse, is like, how do I smooth over this like inconsistency? Well, actually what happened is blah, 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 you know, why the Klingons have normal foreheads in the 60s, but by the 80s, they've got bumps on their foreheads. I get midrash for days on this, guys. But I want to say, if I'm going to be thinking about heroes at all during my seder this year, I think it will be in the context of, you know, when we sort of the contemporary American seder influenced by the freedom seders, and that impulse to think about current oppressions in the world during the seder. I mean, I think that is the time in the seder to think about heroism, because if you wait for the seder's model of the mighty hand and the outstretched arm, we're not going to deal with any of the modern parallels. Like, slavery exists in our world. There is human trafficking. There is, you know, systemic racism in our culture. There are so many liberatory movements out there, and those require more than a mighty hand and an outstretched arm from God. Those require real human heroes. And so I think, you know, if you want to something B'Tselem Elohim, be like God, you know, outstretch your own arm, blah, blah, blah. That's where heroism is relevant to the Seder for me.
I want us to talk for another hour. I have so much to say. I have so much I want to hear.
I know.
So you think, and all of you guys. I want to say two quick things if I can. One is, I love your charge, David. I think it's extremely important. I want to stick up a little bit for the Jews who I don't think were just sheep, mostly because of the courage it takes to actually have Moses say to you, hey guys, you're going to take a lamb, you're going to mark yourself as Jews, there's actually tons and tons of resistance, I think. Not that you're not saying this, but I just want to lift that up for a second, that I think actually to agree to be freed by God took a lot on the part of the Jewish people to stand up, to admit that they were Jewish, to rebel, to decide that they're going to, you know, have their own little seder before they took off. Like, all of those things were powerful moments of resistance that the Jews, I think, took on. So, and I think that is about the charge. And just Anita said this in the comments also, this ability to retell the story actually allows for us to be heroes too. And I wonder if that's the charge of Chayav Adam Lirot et Atzmo, like a person is obligated to see themselves. Is that like, you better stand up and be the Jews in Egypt who didn't let themselves be silenced. Of course, there were miracles and plagues, and those are helpful. But I think that that's like an interesting charge that's in the Haggadah. And one other thing we can't talk about now, but I think is important. We have been, and this came up in the comments, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who said this, but we've been conflating heroism and leadership. And I wonder about those, like, what does it mean to be a good leader versus when do we need heroic leadership? I think that's a really important question. And I also love, Esther, that you said these moments of like, there are tons of tiny moments of heroism that we're doing that also I think speaks to what you're saying, David. So those are my final thoughts. Thank you, guys.
So I will say thank you, Yaffa and David, for being here with me in this space. And I look forward to many other conversations of this nature. And before I throw it back,
let me say one last, wait, let me just jump in with one last thing. I just, you know, I'm going to put my J hat on. Wait, where's my J hat? Hold on, I'm putting my J hat on.
I don't think we have time for props, David.
Nice. Esther is a great TV critic. Once or twice a month, you can find her columns at jweekly.com about American and Israeli TV that has Jews in it. And you can read my recent roundup of like 8 or 9 new 2022 Haggadahs, also at jweekly.com. Andrew just dropped a link in the chat.
Yes, he did. He's on it.
Just got to get my plugs in. That's all.
No,
okay,
definitely. Great. Thank you, David. So before I throw it back to Rebecca to take us out, I want to say also that I love what Yaffa said about you're obligated to see yourself. That is one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the Haggadah, is seeing yourself in the narrative. And the fact that we are so many different lenses in which to see oneself in the narrative, and so many different lenses that we bring as individuals with different perspectives. I think it's a remarkable document that needs to, the Haggadah is a remarkable document that needs to keep evolving, and we need to keep producing more and more Haggadot, even though every year it's going to mean a new roundup for David and for Jewish journalists everywhere where they're inundated with Haggadot. But I think that that's actually showing us that we really have a great appetite for critical analysis and for applying personal lenses to Jewish texts, documents, customs, etc. So I think that that's all a great thing. And as you remember, just not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they wear sandals. So that would be like my plug for, if Moses wanted a catchphrase, I would say that could be his catchphrase. But I think that the idea that there's lots of different ways to look at the text and see yourself in it is one of the most remarkable things about Haggadah. And I'm going to throw it back to Rebecca, but I wanted to just say Chag Sameach, happy and healthy and wonderful and sweet and interesting Passover to all of you. Rebecca, take us out.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther, Yaffa, and David, for just such a wonderful hour together. Before we close, and before I also wish everybody Chag Sameach, I am putting in a link to the chat for our Haggadot.com donate page. If you don't know, if you missed the intro at the beginning, Haggadot.com is a nonprofit organization, and we rely on donations from folks like all of you to help bring the creativity of such amazing people together to produce new Haggadot, like the Schitt's Creek Haggadah, like the Heroes Haggadah. We have a Golden Girls Haggadah coming out this year. So that's my own, more of my own fandom there. And so we are just delighted to have you all here and to be able to celebrate another Passover with all of you together. So Chag Sameach, and we hope to see you on Haggadot.com. And I will also put one other thing in the chat, which is our email address. If you have any questions, we are reachable there, and everybody will receive a copy of the recording of this webinar via email in the coming days. So thank you so much, and Chag Sameach, everybody.